Hi guys, welcome. Thank you for coming. We know it's the end of a long day of sessions, so thanks for making it here. This is for every gamer, making VR and AR truly accessible. So yeah, thanks for attending. So today's panel will feature some emerging thought leaders in accessibility in VR and AR who are thankfully willing to share their experiences and learnings. So yeah, we just wanted to give you a brief introduction, if my computer would work. Technical failure already. Okay, boop. So we just want to give you a brief introduction of the topic, our work, and who we are. So why we're here. According to government data, somewhere between 18 and 20% of the population have some kind of disability, and this figure increases rapidly with age. So, and I should note that when we say disabled, we acknowledge that we're using a broad term to describe visual impairments, hearing impairments, cognitive impairments, motor and mobility impairments. And while we certainly can't address all of these specifically in 1 hour, but we do want people to be mindful of the different aspects we can counter when it comes to accessible game design. So in regards to VR, I just wanted to paraphrase my eloquent friend Ian Hamilton, a UX designer and accessibility expert who couldn't be with us today, but as VR presents opportunities, it can also present barriers. There are some people for whom VR just isn't an option, but there are many others who can be allowed access to VR so long as the software itself is designed in an inclusive way, often by something as simple as allowing a bit of flexibility in how the game is controlled. So it's that process of avoiding unnecessary barriers that is known as accessibility, avoiding the unnecessary mismatch between the person's abilities and the requirements of the software or hardware, and allowing as many people as possible to benefit from all that VR has to offer. So with that, we'll start with some brief introductions and I'll launch into the Q&A. My name is Tracey John. I'm on the advisory board for VRDC. I think I have a slide for that too. So yeah, my career has spanned video game journalism, mobile game development, and most recently interactive experiences in gaming applications for healthcare advertising. So after serving as Vice President, Associate Creative Director at Havas Health, I'm now at Minds and Assembly, an advertising agency specializing in digital healthcare applications. And I'm currently working on a VR project that I hopefully can share with you someday for children who are affected by cognitive disabilities. And with that, we can go down the line and introduce you guys. Oops, sorry. Kayla, you're first.
We should have planned our
I know, the seating, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Brian was like really adamant about sitting right there.
Yeah,
so.
Brian wanted to sit there. So
hi, I'm Kayla. I've started off this off already with swearing. That's a great start. So I've been a game developer for about 16 years now up in beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia. I did a little bit of work helping out with Fantastic Contraption, but most recently I was the director of VR at a studio in Vancouver called Roadhouse Interactive. There I was evangelizing VR as a new platform, building out a whole vertical for that company to explore that space. Gave a lot of VR demos, learned a lot about how people interact with stuff in the VR space. And as we were building out our first title there, I was really trying to explore ways that we could extend user experience and user interaction to mitigate any issues that individuals would have related to mobility challenges or use of two-hand challenges that presented specifically when using motion controllers in VR. So, yeah.
I'm Andy Moore, captain of Radial Games, a game studio I founded almost 10 years ago. Yeah, developers of the launch title for the HTC Vive, Fantastic Contraption, along with our good friends Northway Games helping us out with that. That's all. VR is great and awesome.
And I am Brian Van Buren. I am the narrative designer at Tomorrow Today Labs. We're a small indie studio based out of Seattle, working on a currently unreleased project titled Subject 107, but we also created the Newton VR middleware that so many developers love and use to prototype their products. I am a 10-year industry veteran, starting at Boss Game Studios back in the 90s, but Sierra Games, Nintendo of America, and 17-bit games previous to this. So I am also a wheelchair user, and some of my very first experiences with virtual reality showed me that, the technology, that people were designing spaces that people who didn't necessarily have the same physical capacities as the person who created the game, there's a mismatch that happens there, and it can cause bad experiences or unusable experiences for people. So I began to while I'm becoming a narrative designer and learning as much about user experience as I can. Then I had to start thinking about accessibility design as a subset, and starting to evangelize about that, and go to meetups and go to conferences and talk to people about accessibility in VR, and kind of exploring what I have learned and what other people have learned.
Yeah, that kind of answers my first question, but I wanted to ask you guys, how did you first start thinking about accessibility design in VR? You know, was there something that struck you, or how did you guys sort of get into that?
So for me, when I was first starting kind of evangelizing VR at our studio, I got to put a whole bunch of people through VR, and really the best way to get people to get VR was to show them the HTC Vive and put them through a bunch of experiences. And by that point, I put about 400 people through there, so I'd gotten kind of my demo loop down pat. But one of the individuals that came in was an elderly gentleman who had very reduced mobility. And so as I started kind of thinking through my demo loop and thinking about what I could put him through, the only experience that I could actually safely give him a demo of and expect him to have a good result was the Blue. And it turns out that he was a scuba diver back in his day, and had an immensely positive reaction to that demo, being able to feel what it's like to be underwater again and kind of get that sensation. But again, had trouble because he was sitting down to get the full breadth of the scene, to be able to look at where the whale was coming from and get all that kind of sense of stuff. So really, that kind of catalyzed for me the importance of, while we were building out new experiences, to think about, okay, well, how can I build an experience such that regardless of who comes in and tries the game that we're working on, that I would be comfortable giving them this demo. And so that was really it. And so we set kind of a mandate within the team that we were going to build a room scale experience that you could walk around in, but that the game should be playable by someone that was seated, that was not able to move while seated, and they were able to do it with just a single hand. And that was kind of just we have to have the game playable for that as a baseline, and that kind of drove a lot of design decisions kind of going forward onto that.
Yeah, for the Fantastic Contraption team, it was kind of a happy accident. There wasn't a whole lot of forethought or planning, we were just kind of white knuckle trying to launch a game before the hardware shipped. So it was kind of intense. But there was at one point where we had forgotten to charge the batteries on the Vive controllers, and we only had one hand working. And suddenly our entire UI broke. Nothing worked anymore. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't even win the first tutorial level. So we were kind of looking at it and we're like, well, I guess we have to charge batteries. And one of our teammates, I think it was Lindsay, said, well, if you only have one hand, we should probably try to solve this a different way. And that kind of was the spark. That was the moment where we started giving conscious thought to how we could make the game more accessible to those that may not have our capabilities as developers. And yeah, that just kind of, we were in this very easy to lock in mindset of, we're just gonna make this thing, and all this extra stuff, we're not even gonna think about it. It kind of turned us into, this moment turned us into this point where we could start saying, maybe we should just consciously think about some of these issues and consciously think about some of these problems. And yeah, from then on, it just became a question of, is this a bug, or is this an issue we can actually fix another way?
Oh, great. Obviously, there's very specific reasons that you guys sort of came into thinking about accessible design, but why do you think that creating accessible games is important to just the entire development community?
Well, it forces you as a developer to think outside of your own box. In a lot of instances, the bad designer designing for themselves. You've got people who are, since dealing with room scale spaces, you are bringing a certain amount of your physical presence and physical capacities into the VR space. So if you are an able-bodied adult within the normal height variance and you design an experience for an able-bodied adult within the normal height variance, you are blocking off a large number of people. You're even blocking off yourself at certain age groups. You know, when I talk about putting the able-bodied adult thing is very important in there, because small children are smaller than adults are. They don't have the same reach, don't have the same cognitive capacities. As we age, we physically deteriorate and don't have the same motor function as we had previously, or the same cognitive function. So if you're designing for a very narrow subset of humans, then you may not, you may or may be making the easiest way to make your task completable. Whereas if you think outside of the box and think of, what if I have to do this with one hand? What if I have to have a standing mobile experience that someone who's seated needs to use? Or should I be putting objects on the floor for people who have difficulty bending over? So we are bringing our bodies into this, and if we think of thinking of ways to fix accessibility problems, we may even think of better, or cutting down steps that we were putting in there just because. If you are forcing someone to do a Konami code when just pressing the trigger button will do, then that might be the better way to go about it. So I think, yes, just thinking about it forces you to think about what your process is differently, what you're trying to get done differently, and maybe better ways to get the interactions to occur.
Yeah, my big mantra is I believe strongly that VR is a very powerful medium, a medium that allows for communication at an entirely different level. And I believe that everyone should have the power and ability to experience VR, but also create in VR. And so I believed that strongly before I got onto the accessibility bandwagon in a very conscious way. And really, it's all about kind of making it more accessible to more people, and it's just super important. It's very easy as developers when we're working in our small groups to build for the capabilities of us as groups, and really it's all about kind of expanding that out and being like, okay, well, who is the broader group out there? If you design for two-handed controls, you're leaving out all those individuals that don't have the faculties of a second hand, whether that is due to a physical disability, a temporary disability, maybe they're holding a coffee cup in one hand. There's maybe their batteries are in that thing. There's a whole lot of reasons to simplify design and just make your experience more accessible. And really, I see in VR there's a huge potential for us to offer this. We're creating universes. We have the power to give people these superpowers and have more control in these environments. I see no better medium in which we can really innovate and do some great, crazy, awesome stuff to make our experiences more accessible.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting solutions when you're trying to design with accessibility in mind. You come up with solutions that end up being the kind of killing like 3 or 4 birds with one stone, right? So you might, if you wanted to design an experience that's playable on a desk instead of room scale, you've now solved the problem of people having to bend over, because now everything's at desk height. You've now solved it for children. If you make the desk height variable, that's your small people support, like children and whatnot, that's all solved. Even not being able to walk around in a space, like if you have limited mobility, that's solved. All these problems are solved sometimes with a very simple solution. So just being open in your design and having your design being flexible enough so that you can try to solve multiple problems at once, you can actually open up whole new markets. Not just for, people with disabilities, but people with small living rooms also benefit, right? That in VR, I guess that's a form of disability.
or even not just living spaces, but also if we were developing for the Vive and you're building room scale, one of the great things is once you build for someone that has seated mobility type things, all of a sudden you're now solving for platforms that maybe have more limited tracking areas as well, and that allows your game to be experienced on a larger audience that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, to be sort of devil's advocate to offshoot on that question. No, but obviously thinking about accessibility in your design solves a lot of broader UX issues, which is a lot of your points. But what do you say to naysayers who may be like, well, you can't design for everybody?
Well, it's true. You can't design for everyone, but there are we have been working with accessibility design in software for a good 30 years now. We have had accessibility design standards and accessibility design best practices in video games for about 20 years now. This stuff is all available online. Go to gameaccessibilityguidelines.com. Go to the Includification Project. Go to Microsoft's webpage on how to create an accessible video game. This data is all available. It's just making sure that you take those things into account and take into those suggestions. Mappable controls or for VR, it seems like something that no one's doing because everyone's got hand controls that don't have a whole lot of buttons, and they think, well, I just use the trigger on the Vive controller, and that's all I need, and that's the only situation that the user will ever encounter. I was talking about this on Reddit with a person, and he was talking about a person he knew who was missing these two fingers and could not grasp properly with the Vive controller. If you'd set up button mapping so that either one of the grip buttons or the trackpad could do the same thing as the one-button trigger controller, that person could have used that. And that's not just, and you may think that's an edge case because how many people do you know are missing those fingers? That's also people who have limited hand mobility, and it would make it easier for anyone if someone would prefer that. So we know how to do those things. It's just doing it.
Yeah, like what if you have arthritis,
Yeah.
I mean, like if you want to say that you don't want to make your experience because it's going to be watered down or anything, and you want to make that for an artistic reason, I mean, go nuts. That's fine. But there's no good business reason to not approach accessibility. I mean, if you are actually building product as a business, don't you want to reach the largest user base possible? I don't know, that just makes sense to me.
Yeah, totally. I mean, when I hear naysayers say like, oh, well, I don't want to do that, often what I hear is someone that just doesn't want to think about the problem. But if you were to actually take the time and sit down and think through how you might solve these in your app, you may find it's as simple as doubling up on a button mapping and suddenly you solve half the use cases. Yep. But if you've given it thought and you've sat down and you said, oh, geez, our game just is not compatible, we can't fix this. Okay, like I'm fine with that. If there's no good way to solve it, then you can give a talk on how that's unsolvable, right? Like that's a good opportunity. But I find most people just don't even want to think about it, and I think that's one of the reasons we're doing this panel, is just to get people thinking, because it's not that hard in most cases.
One of the interesting things was I was at Steam Dev Days a couple of weeks back, and as an advocate for accessibility in VR, talking to various different people who are working on VR projects, and each and every about 12 or 13 of them all, and I started talking about accessibility and talking about accessibility use cases in VR, they kind of went like this. And they had that faraway glance, and the gears were turning in their brain.
It's the first time they've thought about it,
yes,
right?
Because it was the first time they'd thought about it. And that's a good thing, because they are now thinking about it and now thinking about, okay, what does this do to my product? In some instances, you may, after you've done your due diligence, you may come to a position where, yes, this doesn't work. I'm trying to make the most realistic baseball batting cage simulator in the world. Well, technically, if you're trying to make the most realistic batting cage simulator in the world, there are 400 people on this planet who should be able to use it. A couple of them play down at the stadium right here. So do you want 400 people, or do you want the softball where millions of people across the world play softball? Or an even larger use case, try wiffle ball. I mean, don't make MLB baseball for VR. Make wiffle ball first.
But make it as exciting as MLB baseball.
Yes, but make it as exciting. It was a lot of fun.
Explosions, cars, car wiffle ball, Rocket League, new updates.
So aside from button mapping, what are some of the things to consider when if you're trying to create an accessible game in VR?
So one of the things that we were experimenting with is extending human reach. And so obviously we're building room scale experience, and the default action is you walk over to something, you pick it up, you walk over to where you want to put it, and you place it down there. And so one of the first things we played with was actually just doing a raycast out from the controller that would kind of highlight whenever that raycast collided with another object in space, and pulling the grab button would just suck that object right into your hand. And that actually worked crazy well and allowed for some insane precision that allowed users to very rapidly grab things from a distance, bring them to them, and then they can kind of move things around. We then extended that and allowed for a half press to hold an object in place where it wasn't a distance, and so that would allow people to actually move an object from a distance at them, and they can kind of move things around. That would also allow them to kind of hold down a half trigger and move their arm backwards and actually extend an object out. And so this allowed basically a user to have full control of object placement within a three-dimensional room scale space, all without actually moving from their chair. And so that was, playing with extending human reach beyond the kind of the basic confines that we have, and using the Vive controller as more of a tool that allowed them to kind of have superhuman reach on that. And so that kind of is how we solved for reach and gestures in the game. The other thing we wanted to solve for was mobility, and one of the easiest things you can do for mobility is to have teleporting in your game. I know there's a bunch of VR devs that are against teleportation as a mechanic in their game, like Andy here. But I believe I believe strongly that just putting it in the game makes the game. It adds a way for somebody to navigate around your space in a very intuitive way, especially if you also add rotation on teleport, so that you can actually highlight a space where you want to go to and then immediately pick a direction you want to face. This would allow somebody that's chair-bound and only able to face in one direction to basically put themselves at any position on the map that you have and face in any direction you want, in a way that is becoming a standard across a lot of different experiences.
I'm gonna let you finish, but
you go ahead, and I'm gonna argue yours.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say why your
actually.
option is stupid.
This gonna be good.
Okay, be nice. Be nice.
No, I think we're creators of a new future of entertainment products, and to think that there's one best solution for all games is probably pretty short-sighted. I do think that teleportation and like extendo hands and all that kind of stuff are all great and can be used in some games, but for our game, we don't do that. We accomplish the same effect using completely different methods. And one of the reasons for that is because we put a lot of thought into how the human body interacts and experiences space with the game. So the actual act of extending your hand out and grabbing something is better than just like hitting a button to auto grab it. It's the same kind of effect of, how everyone loved Wii bowling until you discover you could just sit on the couch and flick your wrist, right? It kind of ruins the game once you discover that, because you could just sit on the couch and flick your wrist. But if we force you to stand up and like throw your arm, then okay, well, it feels better. And we don't know how to quantify that, like the game feels better, but maybe it's an extra half star on our reviews or something, I don't know. But that left this problem of how do we address the people that can't get up and throw their arm across the room, right? So we started adding different methods, and one of the things we added was like a grabby claw. It's you can take a stick and you could telescope it out, still using your physical motion, and you can like hit the buttons on the controller to grab things remotely and still move them. So you still get a sense of connectedness and presence. And instead of going for teleportation, we opted for scaling. So you can actually scale the whole environment so that your natural arm reach can now reach across your room instead of having a teleport button. Now, obviously that doesn't work in many games, right? You can't just say, oh, let's just scale down like Call of Duty. That would be weird. So not every solution works in every application, but if you think about these kinds of things early on in development, even when you're just ideating about what you could possibly make, knowing that scale is an option really opens a lot of doors. Whereas if you try to fix it in post, it's going to be a lot harder.
Yeah, so I'm gonna let you finish. I do agree that scaling can definitely work in some situations, and I kind of jest that I think it's stupid, but it's actually a really smart solution. The one thing though that I caution against scaling is that for me, one of the biggest pros of VR is getting a sense of scale that you get in that medium that you don't get in any other medium. And as soon as you allow for scaling, that can go away very rapidly. And so what I try to look for is accessibility solutions that allow a broad range of options for the player while maintaining as many of the strengths of VR as possible, and that includes scale.
Yeah, I mean, in our project, we have a very limited space project where you're in a closed box, you have near-field interactions that occur directly in front of you. Various items, in order to complete those interactions, are dispensed. And I came into designing that space under the universal design principle, where I was trying to make it so that the dispensers could be accessed from people from multiple heights, and that the objects could be accessed from people at multiple heights. So luckily for me, our art lead is 6'7", and he's not like a narrow 6'7". He's an offensive lineman. He's not a small forward, so he's a big feller. And so between him and myself, we were able to do enough user testing so that if it was something that felt comfortable for him to do standing and something that was comfortable for me to do seated, we kind of thought we'd hit a happy medium there, a general accessibility. That's something that the end user is never going to know is an accessibility, is there for accessibility reasons, but it is. And another issue, so if you looked at the slide earlier, one of the various interactions, or one of the various near-field interactions we're asking you to do is to play a game of beer pong. And there was a ball dispenser that would dispense the ping pong balls that came out, and you would throw them. And you could, if you knocked all the balls out of the container, for Wesley, who is our artist, who is 6'7", who has a bad hip, bad knee, for him to bend over and repeatedly try to pick them up was very painful. And we didn't want to cause him pain, so we ended up putting a detector in there. So if that space is ever empty of balls, it then then pours out a bunch more balls and refills the container. So that. People don't think of that as being an accessibility concern or as a fix for an accessibility option, but it is.
Obviously, you guys were saying for process, it would be ideal to think about accessibility from the start of your project. But let's say you are that Steam developer that's like, oh shit, I made a game and it's really not accessible. What advice do you have for developers who kind of want to try to go back and make their game accessible? Do they next time, or do you have any advice for going back and trying to fix it?
It is obviously way easier to fix all these problems from the beginning.
Yeah.
I think most of us developers understand that kind of trade-off. Yeah. But I think if you're trying to tackle it after the fact, one of the easiest ways is to just do a ton of user testing and watch for the pain points. And pain points could just be like a sigh of frustration if someone keeps having to bend over and pick something up. Like they don't need to, usually the things that get in the way of people that have disabilities, broadly speaking, are annoyances to people that are able-bodied as well, right? And if you just make the experience happy and nice and fun, then you will probably solve most of your problems.
Yeah, we came along, I started at Nintendo right around the time the Wii was launched, and we began to see when the Wii was launched, suddenly this new interaction model that everyone was so enchanted and enthralled with was causing physical issues for them. And in a lot of ways, what they did with the Wii, because it did not have the same, it didn't have the detection technology, you could not be as accurate as you can with a Vive controller or with an Oculus Touch controller. But to an extent, that helped for accessibility reasons, because I always tell this story. For a while, I worked on the Nintendo compliance department, and for some reason, the reason was I would get assigned all the dancing games because I kicked ass at them. If someone needed to get 100% at top difficulty on a Wii dancing game, whatever the stupid thing was, I was the person they called. And I did it every time because I was figuring out what actions they wanted people to do, and then just mimicking them with the controllers. Now, if you as an end user are someone who wants to do all the flourishes and wants to do the spins and whatever and be able to do that, that's great. I was not excluded from having the same experience and being able to play against other people in a recreational way there. But so I kicked ass at Just Dance for the Wii. I couldn't use Just Dance for the Xbox 360 Kinect version. That just wasn't going to work because I was seated and it didn't register what I was trying to do. So in some ways, creating a version of the game that, or trying to shoot for super levels of granularity, that's not always necessary.
So I think, like, to your point, like somebody coming into accessibility issues late into a project, I mean, as developers, we're all really good at doing playtest sessions and getting user feedback and you know, fixing up our game to make it better. This is all part of that. So one of the biggest things you can do is bring in a diverse group of playtesters late into the game. This was some of the best advice I got from Ian Hamilton when I chatted with him earlier this year, is just reach out to your local disability meetup groups or whatever, and bring in some people and have them try your game out. And what you may find is, watching them play your game, you'll learn new ways of interaction. And sometimes those new interaction methods will make the overall game better. Like when we added the vacuuming controls in our game, I got really pissed off playing an earlier build because it just felt so great to be able to grab stuff from all over the place. It just became part of the meta of the game and just became really enjoyable. So play test lots, learn about it, and it'll probably make your game better as a consequence.
And also play test with people of who have various different sorts of disabilities. You know, motor impairment is very different from mobility impairment, which is very difficult from hearing impairment, which is very difficult from vision impairment, which is very different from cognitive impairment. All these things need to have their own specific needs. So, you know, try to, you know, get the person who's got the Coke glass bottle, Coke glass bottle glasses in order, and have that person test your product. Have the person who maybe only has one hand or only has good use of one hand. You may have the person who's deaf in one ear. Our 3D prop modeler is deaf in one ear. And when I was designing an earlier iteration of the game, in order to get people to turn their heads, I would use audio cues because positional audio is such a powerful tool in virtual reality. And then we brought her on board, and I couldn't get her to turn to the right, and that forced me to redesign our trigger system and redesign our cue system, making sure that there was a visual aid, making sure that there was a directional aid, that even in some points, if we had something they wanted someone to look at the right, we would eventually have a flashing arrow show up and go, look over there, and we turn all the lights off over here and turn all the lights on over here, and then eventually people would come to it, and then the trigger would happen. But if she had not been there, I would never have thought of that, and I would just be using a sound cue forever because I didn't know any better.
Is it difficult to recruit for user testing, do you find, if you're trying to reach gamers with disabilities? Have you had issues trying to find people to test?
We didn't get there before the studio shut down.
Oh, well, that's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That definitely make it difficult to recruit testers.
Shut up.
I think that there is a certain enthusiasm amongst disabled gamers.
Yeah.
I think that if you talk to quadriplegics, who they tend to be big-time gamers, and they have very specific needs. They want games that use a mouse and keyboard scheme that they can set up. They can set up a button. They can change the control scheme on and change the button map, and so they can determine which specific mobility aid that they personally have allows them to access that game. Quadriplegics love video games, and if you make it so you are not going to have too much difficulty finding them.
What are some of the other major challenges in creating accessible games in VR that you've found?
Well, I did write an entire article on head height.
Oh yeah, it's excellent. Please check it out.
So for designing spaces that are at a static design that are designed not that have functionality issues if you are at a different head height. There are multiple different ways to get around that, scaling being one of them. Being able to adjust the head height of the user is another one. Being able to, designing the space so that it has under universal design principles. Customizing the physical space that you're in. I had a long Twitter conversation with a gentleman who was making a game that had a large number of near-field interactions. It was kind of a frantic thing where you would pull levers and spin dials and press buttons. And one of the major control panels was on the ceiling, and it had levers. And he was asking me, okay, this is the design that I have. What do I do for people who are seated? How do I make that accessible? And my suggestion to him is make it so that you could change where the height of that panel is. In fact, you should take everything. If you can set it up so that you can put the control panel where you want it, so you can have the control panel as low as is necessary for a seated user to be able to grab it, be able to take and that's not just accessibility. I want to, when the mech game comes out, which if you're not working on it, or if you are working on it, you need someone to play test it. What up? But the mech game, I want to be able to determine where the various different points of information are on my HUD. I want to be able to build that space the same way we customize our desktops that we work on. On the computer, why can't we customize our virtual spaces? They're virtual. You're not hampered by facticity. So I was talking to a gentleman earlier today from Tesla, who, I don't know if he's here or not, but he was talking about how they do their user testing and how they design the spaces for people who are, of various different ages and various different levels of accessibility, and they put them in the car, and then they figure out the space and adjust things as necessary. If I'm in a car-based gaming experience, I want to be able to set where the steering wheel is. And that, I think, and be able to use it with one hand as opposed to two hands, being able to shift with one hand as opposed to two hands. And I think that's the sort of thing that we're not seeing, and people aren't looking at that possibility.
I think we included some semblances of that in Fantastic Contraption. So your toolbox is a cat, and if the cat's on the other side of the room, you can just double click the trigger, and then the cat comes flying. It farts its way over to you by sailing through the air. And you can position the cat anywhere in the world by just clicking your finger and calling the cat wherever you want, which is great to fetch the toolbox, even if you're fully able-bodied and you're just lazy and you don't want to walk over to the cat. I mean, yeah. But something that a lot of people discover fairly quickly is if you pick up the cat and you place it anywhere, at any height, not even on the ground, it'll stay. It'll just hover in that position so that you can customize the play space and put your tools wherever you want them. Same thing with our mini-map. But our game's pretty minimal, so we don't have a lot of opportunity there. But we have made prototypes of other games where every metallic control panel has bolts. And if you undo the bolts, you can pick up the whole control panel and move them. So, it's not difficult to build these kinds of features in. It's just
thinking about them ahead
thinking
of time
about it,
and making that part of central part of the design.
How much do you think that hardware is an issue as well? We talk a lot about things to think about in software in VR, but obviously if you don't have a hand, then you might not want to use the controller. But even I think Brian was telling me a funny story yesterday of trying to control movement in a room, but having to turn his wheelchair, but also hold the Vive controller.
So as a wheelchair user, I kind of turn in a tank fashion where I will turn one wheel one way and one wheel the other way in order to do a tight turn. And for the Vive controllers, when I'm holding them, if I have an interaction where I have to hold down a button with that controller, so if I have to hold down a button in order to keep holding onto an object, that becomes very difficult for me, and because I'm rotating with the palm of my hand rather than just. If it's something where I don't have to do that, generally I'll just put the 5 controllers in my lap, move to the area that I'm at, turn or do whatever the case. Same problem with the Oculus. The sensor ring for the Oculus Touch gets in the way, and I'm using the butt of my palm in order to turn. And this, for something that requires you as a user to make quick turns and quick movement changes, it really screws things up. So one of the nice things that we're seeing, especially in terms of with the Steamvr Tracking, the fact that Valve has made that available and has made the hardware, the sensors available. So at this, you can partner with them and create your own, use the sensors to create your own controllers. And that's really going to make it very easy for people to come up with personalized, I mean, the original Valve Mr. Hat controllers were 3D printed in some guy's place, in some guy's home in Everett. So there's no reason that you can't go to your local makerspace and with a 3D model of a controller that you think is going to work best for you, and then just build it. And that's going to make it a lot easier for people who maybe, if you need to design controllers that have straps on them, to strap the controller into someone's hand because they don't have the grip strength in order to keep the controller to their hand. Or if someone needs to have larger buttons because they have less motor control. These things, the hardware solutions are there. It's just building them.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited about the possibility of different input controllers, being able to work with different people. As developers, I think that becomes important to understand what are the base actions that you're trying to accomplish, and then allowing for the possibility of end users being able to remap those actions to different inputs. And the great thing with VR is it allows for a lot more inputs to just happen naturally. So as opposed to just having a gamepad with a bunch of buttons, you now have 3 devices that are all capable of 6 DOF controls, which opens up the possibilities of controlling a lot of things. So a great example is Eagle Flight. I can fly in Eagle Flight significantly better in a video game than I can in any other controller-based input game because I can use my gaze as a way of flying down there. So you can use gaze, you can use head position. Gaze will get even more higher fidelity when we actually have eyeball tracking, and that will allow for another interaction type. So I think VR is going to open up a lot more ways that humans can provide input to the software, and then as software developers, we just need to look at what are the core actions that we're looking for in our experience, and then how can the end user remap that to best utilize their abilities.
Yeah. As a software developer, I don't think too hard about hardware side of things. I mean, it kind of is what it is, but I do try to think of it as an interesting puzzle, right? It's not that every user has a headset and 2 hands. With the Vive, for example. It's that every user has a maximum of 1 headset and 2 hands plugged into any one machine, right? And that opens up interesting opportunities. So we've built functionality into the game where if you only use 1 hand controller, the other hand controller is available to direct a virtual camera with tracking. Like, there's interesting solutions that can come into play if you play to the bare minimum experience that the hardware may offer. And I've seen some people experimenting with interesting gameplay designs where the hand controllers are intended for a 2nd or 3rd player, and like the main character only uses the headset or things like that. Like, we can get incredibly creative here, and I'm a little disappointed at the lack of creativity, even on our own team. Like, it's really hard to break out of those old thought patterns and create something truly new, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
And this will be the last question before we open it up to audience Q&A. But I guess, can you guys talk about what projects you're working on now, and can you share any learnings so far from these projects in VR?
Well, I think I talked a little bit about the things that I learned with one of the things I've learned through narrative design is to try to be comprehensive in what you're designing. So when you're designing a space in VR, you need to, and you're using it to tell a story or to tell a narrative, to try to use the entire toolkit you have available instead of creating a cutscene, or it's about designing how to make people to look at things and how to use color palettes. We've known since the Greek era how to use color palettes in theater to create mood within a space. It's just rediscovering those sorts of things and also taking things into account. If you are doing a comprehensive cue, something that uses audio, something that uses lighting, something that uses sound, you have a much better chance of an accessibility issue like impairments in vision or impairments in hearing not being a problem, because you use 3 different ways to direct a person's attention, or use 3 different cues where instead of just one. Also, playtest. Everyone has, it's not just doing playtesting. It's going into playtesting with a very specific set of goals that you're trying to accomplish within that playtest session, videotaping the whole thing, taking the notes, having your questions prepared ahead of time, being observant, and really paying attention to what people are doing. We had a project that we were demoing that had a huge, wonderful space-looking, skybox that had the Milky Way and all this stuff, and it was beautiful and it was appealing, and people would just spend all the time in the world just looking up in the sky. And we had things for them to do in the world, but they were much more interested in looking at this beautiful skybox. We had to make it uglier.
Yeah.
Which our art lead was not happy about at all. So.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of spoke about the project that we were working on while I was at Roadhouse. Nothing that I'm working on at the moment. But I think, so for that specific project, we looked at two primary user scenarios. One user that has only the ability to use one arm, and to a user that is only that has limited mobility and is basically a seated, non-rotational user. So I think going forward to my next VR, AR, MR projects, what I'll try to do is, at the very design phase, try to create more hypothetical users with various different ability on the ability spectrum, such that whenever I'm looking at new features, whenever I'm looking at new things in the game, I'm looking at how their needs can be addressed through that, and then also follow that through with playtesting to confirm those hypotheses.
Yeah, we found we were white knuckling it to launch so hard for Fantastic Contraption. We barely got the game done in time for the launch, and basically up until yesterday, we only really supported room scale play. We launched a beta yesterday that has the scaling that I've been talking about here, and it's not even officially launched. It's just in beta right now. Looking for feedback on it. So we're still working on that, and we're still iterating and trying to make it perfect. But I'd say, the interesting things we've learned over time, and these are the kinds of things you only get with real world testing. I don't mean like you bring in people and you put them into your testing rig. I mean, you install it on someone's computer secretly, and then you use your hidden cameras to see if they ever actually play it, like that kind of beta testing, right? And in those circumstances, you find things like because we totally do that. We just tap into everyone's webcam.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's why I only play Fantastic Contraption naked.
So we noticed things like many Vive players don't use headphones at all. So if you rely on audio cues, then you can't, right? So if you correct for that, then you also correct for audible disabilities, right? We also found that if you don't support seated play, then good luck having a successful title on, say, PSVR. If you don't support forward-facing gameplay only, then good luck launching on Oculus, right? Like a lot of these things that we thought would be solved by the hardware, solved by the tech, have over the last year kind of borne out to be, well, if you solve for disabilities, you also grow your market incredibly. Like, it's kind of silly not to.
All right, thank you. I think we're going to go into audience Q&A now before we run out of time. So there's a microphone in the center. Don't be shy. Anyone?
Hey, sorry, I had to scoot back there.
It's a user experience issue. The microphone should be placed right at the front.
Right. I think the ramp is actually preventing, which is like a better UX than the mic. I was going to ask, I think part of the reason this conference came together is that VR development is extending outside of the world of games, which, as I began listening to this panel, made me think of regulations and standards for accessibility that exist in other environments, and I think like if VR is going to try and be smartphone grade, like this is now in people's homes, does that mean that some kind of regulation becomes part of the future ecosystem, or does it like industry standards? Like, how do you feel about something beyond, about the way that that could affect VR development as a whole, not just for games?
I really hope so. Like especially when I look forward to like an MR future, I have like these brilliant amazing visions in my head of what the future of urban infrastructure would be like with mixed reality type stuff. I'm fortunate that I live in Vancouver, a city that is really forward thinking in terms of accessibility guidelines. There's a lot of mandates within the city of accessibility for a lot of different users with different abilities. So I really hope that as this technology goes further, that there are some mandates of ensuring that at least certain bars are met, such that. So I believe fully that in the future, VR, AR, MR is going to become an integral aspect of our lives. That it's going to make humans more capable, and the only way in order to make that fair across the entire population is to have certain standards in terms of what who can have access to that and work within that. So,
yeah, I think if you can make a change to make your application more accessible, and you don't, and your competitors do, that's probably enough market pressure to make the right change over enough time. But if we need some regulation in the meantime to help spur that along, I'm all for it. But yeah.
Well, for anyone who, first of all, I'd like to talk about Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which means any software that is purchased by any state, federal, or local government agency requires reasonable accessibility options. I'd bring you to Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act that requires that there can be no discrimination in hiring practices, including training and equipment usage. So any training software that you're trying to sell to people is going to need to have some sort of accessibility option. Schools are mostly paid for by the government, so they are going to follow under Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. So if you want your product to be used in a school for teaching purposes, you're going to need to have accessibility options put into them. And at the end, and let's not act like these laws aren't still coming. The 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act just came out in 2010, and we, as a gaming industry, we're still pushing it off. The ESA is still applying for those rules to be pushed back further and further. A guy I know who works on the Xbox dashboard team, they just finished getting their compliance ready just in case it doesn't get pushed back to 2018. So there are laws that exist with that, and if we are reaching because those laws don't apply to entertainment software, that doesn't mean you should not use that. That does not exempt you from giving those things the opportunity. Obviously, Microsoft are the masters of accessibility in software because they have to sell to the US government, they have to sell to the English government, they have to sell to European Commonwealth nations who all have similar accessibility requirements. And if, as Kayla was saying, if we get to that mixed reality future, if, as it has been called, the merger of VR and AR and machine learning creating the final platform or the last platform, then accessibility, if this does replace your desktop, your laptop, your smartphone, your television, this accessibility may not be a luxury for the entertainment sphere. It may be a requirement. So it's better on us to be driving the change than someone who doesn't necessarily understand it. And from the government side of things, they may not.
Yeah, and that's not theoretical. Fantastic Contraption gets a lot of interest from the education community as an educational tool, and that wouldn't be an option open to us if we didn't consider these kinds of things.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on accessibility in multiplayer games where balance becomes an issue? So I know like height is a big one, but when you calibrate height, I've seen games where people that aren't short or tall or seated use that as an advantage, right? They calibrate their headset on the floor, and their avatar is tiny and those kind of things.
Yep, that's a tough one. I mean, and I, as someone who has seen multiplayer games and the difficulties of multiplayer in VR to begin with, I don't know what the answer is to that. There isn't an easy answer to how do you prevent people gaming the system.
I think a lot of these problems are because we're stuck thinking about old game design practices, right? Like we have these old designs in our head and they're not really compatible with height changes. I think the kids of tomorrow, damn kids, are going to invent some amazing games where this isn't a problem from the fundamental design perspective. And I'm like, I wish I could think of those designs, but I think my brain won't let me because I'm stuck in the past. I'm too old.
Yeah, the 5-year-old growing who's playing Tilt Brush now is going to come up with the ideas that needs to
I'm so
come up
excited
with
for the
that.
next
And
generation.
I think that's the big thing, is like when we think multiplayer right now, we think competitive in terms of thing, whereas
As
I
opposed
think-
to cooperative.
Yeah, whereas I think multiplayer in VR, one of the most compelling things to do is co-creating of spaces. In which case, if you're working together on something, it's not a competition. You don't have to worry about fairness right there. It's better experience.
And I think as we're getting better and better at making games, we're making more and more experiences that are asymmetrical, which may lend itself to this, right? It's harder to make chess work, but something.
But not
crazy
everyone's
new.
going to make chess.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, and
exactly.
if there is a game where one person has a certain set of capacities and another person who's also playing the game has a separate and different and asymmetrical set of capacities, and the two of you are forced to work together towards a common goal, that's compelling, and that's you learning your limitations and your what you're good and bad at, and then people love learning systems. It's kind of what we're hardwired to do as human beings.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think, instead of trying to say, how do I fix this in my game, think instead, how do I make a game that doesn't have this as a fundamental problem?
Great.
So you guys have talked a lot about making games accessible. What do you think about using VR or AR as tools to make the real world more accessible to other people?
Oh, baby, let me tell you.
How accessible has this conference been for you?
Okay, so that ramp wasn't here this morning. Like, the first thing I did after I grabbed my badge was check out the room to figure it out, and I was like, that ramp wasn't here. In fact, it wasn't here till lunch. So it took them that long to put it together. In an AR sort of situation, I would love the idea of having an accessible pathway so I know where the ramps are as opposed to have to, hunt them down as opposed to where the stairs are. I would love to have those sorts of things. Anything that you can do in terms of AR improving the lives of a normal of your normal experience, will have double usage for people who have impairments, whatever they may be.
Yeah, like I think the big thing is disability is a mismatch between one's ability and what's required of them, and there's like this huge potential for technology to kind of fill in that gap in a bunch of different ways. We found a lot of ways to do that through screen-based media, but now that we're actually going to be able to completely change people's vision and their hearing, there's huge possibilities right there whereby the real world can be augmented for a user such that they're able to navigate it a lot more effectively, basically making us better humans.
I mean, I'm an able-bodied, tall, white man. I'm able to go anywhere on the planet fairly safely and do whatever I want. And
You need a pith helmet when you say that.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm painfully aware of that, but VR has made my life better. And I've seen things that I will never see because of VR, real-life things. And we're at Gen 1. Or 0.5, right? I can't imagine how much better the world is going to be once we're at like generation 10 augmented reality helmets.
One of the, as I was talking about things that you couldn't do, the Everest VR Experience is a very compelling one. And I, as a wheelchair user, probably couldn't physically do that. The majority of people who do that experience probably could physically do that, but they never will. And so for whatever that reason may be, we talk about, accessibility in terms of physical accessibility. Well, what about economic accessibility? What about distance accessibility? These are the sorts of barriers that VR breaks down and AR breaks down that we're not talking about, but that is what's happening. And so, what happens when the person in the educational softwares across the country is standardized, so the kid who lives in the ritzy upscale district school has the same software and same equipment as the person who lives at the low-income urban district, and everybody's still learning using the same programs and learning how to do the same things. That's a great leveler. Tech has always been the great accessibility leveler. From the first time someone put a set of caster wheels on a chair that allowed a person who could not walk to move around the space, it has always been the great leveler, and it's going to continue to be more so, even with this tech and with others.
Last question. Thank
Yeah,
you.
this is a question about performance, different user interface techniques, fantastic contraption. I could probably give you a two-handed interface that would solve many of your problems in the wheelchair, but it requires two hands. Multimodal is a great thing. I mean, obviously we could do various things one hand, but you're not going to have the same performance. Are you going to require that people be able to get the same score? I mean, this is really a very basic question.
No, I mean, that is a legitimate concern. I think that if you are creating a good faith attempt to create something that, or creates a multimodal way for people who are, who have to use the one-handed control scheme to still participate, then maybe the person with the two-handed control scheme would, it goes back to the Just Dance thing, where, you know, I think that as a disabled user, the capacity to participate might be better, that might be more important than the capacity to compete at the same level.
Yeah.
You know, that goes for any sort of endeavor. It's like if we stick you over at the baseball stadium, you're not going to be able to hit off a hit off a pitching machine, much less a major league pitcher. Yeah. So I don't think that requirement's going to be there of make you have to. Oh, I'm not going to require you to dumb it down. But if you can find a way so that people who on a two-handed experience can participate one-handed, I think they will care more. And gosh, you don't know for people who have disabilities how magical a leveler video games can be, and how that they engage in a sense of community. I was 15 when I ended up in a wheelchair, and I'm not going to go through the whole story of how it happened, but the people that I am still friends with from that time frame, we all played video games together. And a number of us ended up in the industry. But video games, especially online games, all these things allow people who are trapped under a certain physical facticity to operate in the same facticity as everyone else. And to be able to participate is, even if it's not at the same level, we're used to not being able to participate at the same level, you know. There's a ramp right there that wasn't here this morning. That's how I got up here. We're used to accommodations needing to be made, but that doesn't mean you don't make the accommodation.
Yeah, I agree. If the only alternative is not letting people play at all, I'd rather have them play. And we get a lot of emails and tweets from people saying, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to even try your game. And that's heartwarming and it's awesome. And yeah. But again, design the game so that it's not a problem. Instead of trying to fix the game that already exists.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. On that note, we are getting the eye and the door is open, but thank you guys so much. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone for attending. Let's go drink.